Hello there and welcome. Tonight's gentle journey explores one of the most puzzling concepts we encounter daily yet rarely examine. Nothing. It sounds so simple, doesn't it? Nothing. Just the absence of something. But like most things that seem obvious at first glance, nothing turns out to be surprisingly complicated, wonderfully paradoxical, and occasionally quite something indeed. Before we dive into this delightful void, I'd love to know where in the world you're listening from tonight, and what's the one thing you're hoping to let go of as you settle in. Perhaps it's the weight of a busy day, or maybe just the need to understand everything perfectly. Either way, you're in the right place for a journey that celebrates questions more than answers, mysteries more than solutions. Now, I do hope this isn't so intriguing that it keeps you wide awake, but if it does, at least you'll drift off having pondered one of philosophy's oldest riddles. So settle back, let your thoughts grow quiet, and let's begin our journey into nothing, because somewhere between empty spaces and absent things, between silence and the void, lies a mystery that has puzzled humans for thousands of years, and will likely puzzle us for thousands more. Nothing surrounds us constantly, yet we rarely pause to consider what it actually means. Right now, as you listen to these words, you're surrounded by it. The space between your fingers as you hold your device. The pause between one breath and the next. The moment of silence between these sentences. Nothing isn't exotic or rare. It's perhaps the most common thing we never think about. The most present absence in our lives. We use the word casually, almost carelessly. What are you thinking about? Nothing. What did you do today? Nothing much. What's in that empty box? Nothing. But each of these nothings means something different, refers to a different kind of absence, implies a different relationship between what is and what isn't. The nothing in your thoughts is not the same as the nothing in an empty container, which is not the same as the nothing that happens on a quiet day. This multiplicity of nothings hints at something profound. Perhaps nothing isn't as simple as we assumed. Perhaps it's not just the opposite of something, not just what's left when you take everything away. Perhaps nothing has its own nature, its own characteristics, its own strange and subtle presence that we're only beginning to understand. Consider how nothing shapes everything around you. The empty space in this room allows you to move through it. Without that nothingness between the walls, between the furniture, between your body and other objects, you'd be trapped in a solid block of matter. The nothing creates the possibility for something to exist, to move, to change. It's not just absence. It's the condition that makes presence possible. Even this sentence depends on nothing. The spaces between words give them meaning, allow them to be distinguished from one another. Without those gaps of nothingness, this would be one long, incomprehensible string of letters. Nothing, it seems, is what makes something intelligible, what gives form to information, what transforms noise into signal. Your own experience is full of meaningful nothings, the pause before you speak, giving weight to your words, the silence between musical notes that creates rhythm and melody, the moment of not knowing before insight arrives, the empty space in your schedule that allows for spontaneity and rest. These aren't just gaps in your life. They're essential features that give shape and meaning to everything else. Yet nothing makes us uncomfortable in ways that something rarely does. We fill silences with chatter, empty moments with activities, quiet spaces with noise. We seem to have an instinctive aversion to emptiness, as if nothing were somehow dangerous, something to be avoided or overcome rather than experienced and appreciated. This discomfort with nothing might be deeply human, built into how our minds work. We're pattern-seeking creatures, constantly scanning for threats, opportunities, meanings. A mind that could rest comfortably in pure emptiness might not have survived long enough to pass on its genes. We're the descendants of ancestors who filled apparent nothings with vigilant attention, who treated empty spaces as potential hiding places for predators, who heard silence as the absence of the all-clear signals that indicated safety. But perhaps we've inherited more than we need. In our modern world, the ability to be comfortable with nothing, to rest in emptiness without needing to fill it, to sit with not knowing without immediately rushing to conclusions might be more valuable than ever. The person who can be present with nothing might discover kinds of peace, creativity, and wisdom that aren't available to those who must always be busy with something. So as we begin this exploration together, we're not just investigating an abstract philosophical concept. We're examining something intimate and immediate, something that touches every moment of your life, something that might hold keys to different ways of being in the world. Nothing isn't just out there in the universe waiting to be understood. It's right here, right now, in the spaces between these words, in the quiet awareness that receives them, in the mysterious openness that makes any experience possible at all. Let's start with the nothing you know best, the nothing in your empty coffee cup, the nothing in your bank account after a shopping spree, the nothing you claim to be thinking about when someone asks what's on your mind. This everyday nothing feels straightforward enough. It's simply the absence of something we expected or wanted to be there. But even this simple nothing gets curious when you look closer, revealing layers of complexity hidden beneath its apparent obviousness. Take that empty coffee cup sitting on your desk. Is it really empty? Well, it's full of air, which is full of molecules bouncing around like invisible ping-pong balls at incredible speeds. Trillions of nitrogen and oxygen molecules are careening through that cup space every second, colliding with each other, and the cup walls in a constant frenzy of molecular activity. So it's not empty of everything, just empty of coffee, which happens to be the specific thing you wanted it to contain. The emptiness is relative, contextual, defined entirely by your expectations and desires rather than by any absolute absence. Or consider the nothing between your fingers when you hold up your hand and spread them apart. That space seems empty, a perfect example of pure nothingness. But that apparently vacant gap is actually buzzing with activity invisible to your senses. Electromagnetic fields permeate it, carrying radio waves from distant stations, cell phone signals, cosmic radiation from exploding stars billions of miles away. Quantum fields fluctuate there in ways that physics has only recently begun to understand. Your fingers exist in relationship to each other across that apparent nothingness, defining each other's position in space, creating a hand-shaped absence that has its own form and meaning. This suggests our first hint about nothing. It might not be the complete absence we think it is, but rather the absence of particular things we happen to care about at any given moment. When you say there's nothing in the refrigerator, you usually mean there's nothing appetizing, nothing that appeals to your current hunger or dietary preferences, not that the refrigerator has somehow achieved a perfect vacuum and contains literally no matter whatsoever. The shelves might be full of condiments, leftovers, and items you're ignoring, but from the perspective of your immediate needs, there's nothing there. Language reveals how personal and contextual our relationship with nothing really is. When we say nothing happened today, we don't mean the earth stopped rotating, or your heart stopped beating, or the sun forgot to shine, or billions of people stopped going about their lives. We mean nothing noteworthy from your particular perspective, nothing worth mentioning in the context of your specific concerns and interests, nothing that broke the comfortable pattern of your ordinary existence. Nothing in this sense is deeply subjective, a judgment about relevance and significance rather than an objective description of reality. The nothing that appears in your inner life is even more complex. When you report thinking about nothing, sitting in meditation and experiencing mental emptiness, or having your mind go blank during a stressful moment, what's actually happening in those states? Your brain is still incredibly active, processing sensory information, maintaining bodily functions, generating the continuous stream of background mental activity that keeps you alive and conscious. The nothing you experience is more like the absence of particular kinds of thinking, goal-directed thoughts, problem-solving, narrative construction, analytical processing. It's the nothing of not being caught up in mental content, not the nothing of mental inactivity. Children understand this instinctive relativity of nothing in ways that adults often forget. Ask a child what they're doing, and they might say nothing, while actively building an elaborate fort out of couch cushions, creating complex imaginary worlds, or engaging in the serious business of play that occupies their entire attention. They're not lying or being evasive. From their perspective, fort building isn't doing something official or important in the adult sense of productive activity. It's just the natural state of being a child, which to them might feel like nothing special, nothing worth reporting, nothing that fits adult categories of meaningful action. This reveals something profound about nothing. It's always defined by contrast, always relative to expectations, always shaped by the perspective of whoever is making the judgment about absence. The same situation can be full of something from one viewpoint and empty of everything from another. Your quiet evening at home might feel like peaceful, nothing to you but like missing out on something to a friend who thrives on social stimulation. Your busy schedule might feel like overwhelming something to you, but like enviable productivity to someone struggling with depression and inactivity. Even the physical sciences, which try to be objective about these matters, encounter this relativity of nothing. A physicist's vacuum, supposedly empty of all matter, is still full of quantum fields, electromagnetic radiation, and virtual particles that pop into and out of existence too quickly to be directly observed. The best laboratory vacuums still contain occasional atoms, and even if you could remove every particle, you'd still have space itself, which according to modern physics has properties, behaviors, and characteristics that make it very much something rather than nothing. So even in our everyday experience, nothing is relative, contextual, and surprisingly full of implied somethings. Its absence defined by presence, emptiness given meaning by fullness, silence that only makes sense because of sound, space that matters only because of the objects it separates and contains. Nothing never stands alone. It always exists in relationship, always depends on something else for its definition, always carries within itself the implicit presence of what it lacks. This relational nature of nothing will follow us throughout our exploration, showing up in every domain where humans encounter absence, emptiness, or void. Nothing, it seems, is never simple, never pure, never just nothing at all. Long before we had microscopes to peek into empty spaces or telescopes to stare into cosmic voids, ancient philosophers were wrestling with nothing, and they found it quite troublesome indeed. The Greeks, in particular, had strong opinions about nothing, and those opinions shaped Western thought for centuries, creating intellectual battles that continue to echo through modern philosophy and science. Parmenides, a philosopher from around 500 BCE, made one of the boldest claims in intellectual history. Nothing cannot exist. His logic was elegantly simple and devastatingly thorough. If nothing existed, he argued, it would be something which is a contradiction. To exist is to be something, so non-existence cannot itself exist. Therefore, nothing is impossible, not just difficult to achieve or rare to encounter, but logically incoherent as a concept. The universe must be completely full, he insisted, with no empty spaces anywhere, no gaps, no absences, no voids of any kind. This created quite the philosophical pickle that philosophers are still trying to untangle today. If Parmenides was right, then the entire world of appearances, everything we see moving and changing around us, must be some kind of cosmic hallucination. Trees don't really grow, because growth requires empty space for the tree to expand into. Rivers don't really flow, because flowing requires empty space for water to move through. You didn't really get out of bed this morning, because movement requires void to move into. Change itself becomes impossible because it would require things to move from where they are to where they aren't, but where they aren't cannot exist. Parmenides wasn't just making an abstract logical point. He was seriously arguing that multiplicity, change, and motion are all illusions. Reality, in his view, is a single, unchanging, eternal, indivisible unity with no internal differences, no parts, no boundaries, no beginning or end. What we take to be the rich, varied, dynamic world of our experience is merely the confused testimony of our unreliable senses, while true reality is accessible only through pure rational thought. Democritus had a radically different idea that would eventually prove more influential for the development of science. He proposed that the universe was made of tiny, indivisible particles called atoms, and these atoms moved through void, through actual nothingness that really existed as a kind of space or container. This was scandalous thinking that directly contradicted Parmenides. To make void acceptable to rational thought, Democritus had to perform a conceptual sleight of hand. He argued that nothing was, in a sense, something. The void had to exist in order for atoms to move through it, so nothingness became a kind of existing non-existence, a real absence that occupied space and allowed motion. This atomic theory was remarkably prescient, anticipating by over 2,000 years our modern understanding of matter as composed of discrete particles moving through mostly empty space. But it created its own philosophical puzzles that we're still working through. If void exists, what kind of existence does it have? Is it a substance, a property, a relationship, or something else entirely? How can absence be present? How can non-being have being? Aristotle tried to solve the problem by declaring that nature abhors a vacuum, a phrase that became so influential it's still commonly used today. In his view, empty space was not just unlikely, but actively opposed by the natural world itself. If you tried to create a perfect void, nature would immediately conspire to fill it. This wasn't just philosophical speculation. It seemed to match everyday experience. Create suction with your mouth, and air rushes in to fill the partial vacuum. Remove water from a container, and air takes its place. Remove air from a container, and the container collapses, or other substances seep in. The universe appeared to be in constant conspiracy against emptiness. But Aristotle's solution created its own problems that medieval scholars would struggle with for centuries. If nature truly abhors a vacuum, how do we explain the spaces between things that seem necessary for motion and change? How does an arrow fly through the air without the air parting to make room for it? Aristotle's answer was ingenious, but ultimately unsatisfying. Things moved by being pushed from behind, by the medium they moved through, rather than being pulled into empty space ahead of them. An arrow flies because the air behind it keeps pushing it forward, not because there's empty space in front for it to move into. Medieval scholars inherited these puzzles and added their own theological complications that made the problems even more intricate. If God created everything, did God create nothing too? This wasn't just a clever wordplay question. It touched fundamental issues about the nature of divine power and creation. Could an omnipotent deity make perfect emptiness? And if nothing existed before creation, what did God create the universe out of? How can something come from nothing, and how can nothing be the source of something? The scholastic philosophers developed sophisticated responses to these challenges. They coined the Latin phrase ex nihilo nihil fit, nothing comes from nothing. This seemed to support the idea that nothing was impossible while still allowing for divine creation from nothingness, which was considered a special case of God's infinite power that transcended ordinary logical constraints. God could create something from nothing, not because nothing was really something in disguise, but because divine omnipotence could perform actions that were impossible for finite beings operating within natural law. These ancient debates might seem purely academic now, the kind of abstract speculation that has little relevance to practical life. But they were grappling with something profound that continues to challenge us today: the relationship between existence and non-existence, between what is and what isn't, between the full richness of experienced reality and the apparent emptiness that seems to surround and permeate it. They were trying to understand whether nothing was simply the absence of things, or whether it might be something more mysterious, more fundamental, perhaps even more real than the busy world of objects and events we think we inhabit. The questions they raised haven't been resolved. They've been refined, complicated, and translated into new vocabularies, but the fundamental puzzles remain as perplexing as ever. Modern physics has given us quantum vacuums and virtual particles, but we still don't fully understand what it means for something to not exist. We have mathematical tools for working with empty sets and zero values, but we're still puzzled about the relationship between mathematical nothingness and physical reality. We've mapped the brain activity associated with experiences of emptiness, but we're still mystified by consciousness and its peculiar ability to be aware of what isn't there. Now, you might think that modern physics would have settled the ancient debate about nothing once and for all. After all, we have particle accelerators that can probe the smallest scales of reality, vacuum chambers that can remove virtually all matter from a space, and instruments sensitive enough to detect the faintest whispers of activity in apparently empty regions. Surely we can create perfect nothingness and study it directly, finally resolving the philosophical puzzles that have persisted for millennia. But it turns out that nothing, even in physics, refuses to behave simply or surrender its mysteries easily. The more precisely we try to create emptiness, the more we discover that truly empty space might be impossible, not because nature abhors a vacuum in some philosophical sense, but because the fundamental laws of physics themselves seem to forbid perfect nothingness. Every attempt to create true void reveals new layers of activity, new forms of something masquerading as nothing, new complexities hidden within apparent simplicity. Let's start with what seems like the easiest kind of nothing to create, a mechanical vacuum, a container with all the air and matter removed. Modern vacuum technology is remarkably sophisticated, capable of removing virtually all particles from a chamber through combinations of mechanical pumps, diffusion pumps, and ion pumps. The best ultra-high vacuum systems can reduce the pressure to less than 1/1,000,000th of atmospheric pressure, leaving only a few atoms per cubic centimeter in a space that normally contains billions of molecules. But even in the most perfect laboratory vacuum ever achieved, there are still particles floating around, still matter present in tiny quantities. And suppose we could somehow remove every last atom, every electron, every photon, every bit of matter and energy from a region of space. Would we finally have achieved true nothingness, the perfect void that has eluded philosophers for centuries? This is where quantum mechanics crashes the party with its characteristic weirdness, revealing that our intuitive notion of empty space as simply the absence of things is fundamentally mistaken. According to quantum field theory, what we think of as empty space is actually seething with activity, filled with quantum fields fluctuating at their lowest possible energy states. These fields permeate all of space, and even when they contain no particles, no excitations above their ground states, they're still present, still active, still contributing to the structure and behavior of reality. These quantum vacuum fluctuations aren't just theoretical abstractions that exist only in the minds of physicists. They have measurable, observable effects that have been confirmed by numerous experiments. One of the most famous is the Casimir effect, discovered by Dutch physicist Hendrik Casimir in 1948. If you place two perfectly smooth, parallel metal plates very close together in a vacuum, they experience a tiny attractive force pushing them together. This force doesn't come from any conventional matter or energy between the plates. It comes from the quantum vacuum itself. The explanation involves one of the strangest ideas in physics: virtual particles that exist for incredibly brief moments before disappearing again. The quantum vacuum is constantly creating pairs of particles and antiparticles that appear out of nothing, exist for time intervals so short they can't be directly observed, then annihilate each other and return to nothingness. This happens everywhere in space, all the time, but normally the effects average out and cancel. However, between the closely spaced plates, only virtual particles with certain wavelengths can exist, while the space outside the plates can support virtual particles of all wavelengths. This creates a pressure imbalance, and the plates are pushed together by what amounts to the pressure of nothingness itself. The Casimir effect has been measured with extraordinary precision, confirming that the quantum vacuum is far from empty. It's a bubbling sea of virtual activity, a foam of fleeting existence that gives empty space structure, energy, and measurable properties. This quantum foam means that perfect nothingness is not just practically difficult to achieve, but impossible in principle, according to our best understanding of physics. This leads to one of the most perplexing numbers in all of science, the cosmological constant, which is related to the energy density of empty space itself. When physicists try to calculate how much energy the quantum vacuum should have based on quantum field theory, they get an answer that's spectacularly wrong. The theoretical prediction exceeds the observed value by a factor of about 10 to the power of 120. That's not a small error or a rounding mistake. It's the most incorrect prediction in the history of science, wrong by a number with 120 zeros after it. This suggests that either our understanding of quantum vacuums is deeply, fundamentally flawed, or there's some mysterious mechanism that almost perfectly cancels out the enormous energy that should be present in empty space according to our theories. Either way, nothing is far more complicated and puzzling than nothing should reasonably be. The very foundation of reality, the background against which everything else happens, turns out to be one of the deepest mysteries in physics. Even more mysteriously, cosmologists have discovered that empty space itself appears to be expanding, and this expansion seems to be accelerating. The universe isn't just getting bigger because things are moving apart through space. Space itself is stretching, creating new nothingness between galaxies at an ever-increasing rate. This expansion seems to be driven by something called dark energy, which appears to be a property of empty space itself, an intrinsic feature of the vacuum that pushes things apart and creates more of itself as the universe grows. Dark energy makes up about 70% of the total energy content of the universe, making it the dominant component of everything that exists. Yet we have no idea what it actually is, how it works, or why it has the properties it does. The most successful theory of physics in history cannot explain the behavior of empty space, the very arena in which all other physical processes take place. So the physics of nothing reveals a profound paradox that continues to challenge our understanding of reality. The more carefully we examine emptiness, the more active and complex it becomes. Perfect nothingness seems to be not just practically difficult to achieve, but theoretically impossible according to the laws of nature. The vacuum is alive with invisible activity. Space itself has properties and behaviors that affect everything within it, and even the concept of removing everything from a region appears to be fundamentally problematic. Nothing, according to modern physics, is always something, and often something very strange and important indeed. Mathematics has its own peculiar relationship with nothing, and it's a relationship that took centuries to work out, involving some of humanity's most brilliant minds wrestling with concepts that seem to threaten the very foundations of logical thought. The story of nothing in mathematics is really the story of zero, one of humanity's most profound and troublesome inventions, a number that represents the absence of quantity, yet somehow became essential for representing all other quantities. It's hard to imagine now, but zero didn't always exist in human mathematical systems. The concept seems so basic, so fundamental to how we think about numbers, that its absence feels almost incomprehensible. Yet for most of human history, civilizations managed quite well without any symbol or concept for nothing. Roman numerals, which dominated European mathematics for over a millennium, had no zero. Try writing the number 1005 in Roman numerals and you'll immediately see the problem. MV might look like it means 1005, but it actually represents 1005 only through context and convention, not through any systematic positional logic. The Romans, like many ancient civilizations, used positional tricks, spacing, and contextual clues to handle situations where zero might have been useful. They could perform calculations and keep records, build aqueducts, and manage an empire, all without any mathematical representation of nothingness. But their system was cumbersome, limited, and prone to ambiguity in ways that seem almost absurd from our modern perspective. The concept of zero as a mathematical entity emerged gradually in ancient India, probably around the 5th century CE, though the exact origins remain debated among historians. Indian mathematicians weren't just creating a placeholder symbol to indicate empty positions in a number system, they were doing something far more radical and conceptually sophisticated. They were transforming nothing into something mathematical, creating a number that could be added, subtracted, multiplied, and manipulated like any other quantity. This was revolutionary thinking that required a fundamental shift in how humans conceived of absence and presence. The Indian mathematician Brahmagupta, working in the 7th century, developed systematic rules for calculating with zero that sound familiar to us now but were genuinely groundbreaking at the time. 0 plus any number equals that number. 0 minus any number gives the negative of that number. Any number minus itself equals 0. These rules seem obvious now because we've internalized them so completely, but they represent profound insights into the mathematical nature of nothingness. But zero brought problems that mathematicians are still grappling with today. Division by zero broke arithmetic in fundamental ways that couldn't be easily repaired. What is 5 divided by 0? The question seems to demand an answer, but no answer makes mathematical sense. If you divide 5 things into 0 groups, how many things are in each group? The question itself doesn't parse logically. If division is the inverse of multiplication, then 5 divided by 0 should equal some number that, when multiplied by 0, gives 5. But any number multiplied by 0 equals 0, never 5. Medieval European scholars, when they first encountered zero through translations of Indian and Arabic mathematical texts, were deeply suspicious of this strange non-number. How could nothing be something? How could emptiness be counted, calculated, manipulated like a real quantity? Some authorities actually banned the use of zero, fearing it would lead to logical contradictions that would undermine the certainty and reliability of mathematical knowledge. They saw it as a dangerous innovation that threatened the intellectual order they had worked so hard to establish. But zero's usefulness was ultimately undeniable, despite the philosophical and practical problems it created. It made positional notation possible, allowing mathematicians to distinguish clearly between 5, 50, 500, and 5,000 using simple, systematic rules rather than complex symbol combinations. It enabled calculations that would have been extraordinarily cumbersome with Roman numerals or other zeroless systems. Eventually, European mathematics embraced zero not just as a placeholder, but as a legitimate number with its own properties and behaviors. Set theory, developed in the late 19th and early 20th centuries by mathematicians like Georg Cantor and Gottlob Frege, gave nothing an even more fundamental role in mathematical thought. The empty set, the set containing nothing at all, became the foundation from which all other mathematical structures could be constructed. This wasn't just a convenient starting point. It was a demonstration that everything in mathematics, from the simplest counting numbers to the most abstract geometric concepts, could be built starting with nothing but the empty set and rules for combining sets. This is remarkably profound when you think about it carefully. All of mathematics, from basic arithmetic to complex topology, from elementary geometry to advanced calculus, can be constructed starting with pure nothingness. The empty set serves as a kind of mathematical void from which entire universes of mathematical objects emerge through systematic construction. Zero isn't just the absence of quantity. It's the seed from which all quantity grows, the foundation upon which the entire edifice of mathematical knowledge rests. Calculus introduced another kind of mathematical nothing that proved equally important and problematic. Infinitesimals, quantities that are supposed to be smaller than any positive number, yet somehow different from zero. For centuries, infinitesimals lived in a mathematical limbo that made many mathematicians uncomfortable. Newton and Leibniz used them successfully to develop calculus, solving problems that had been impossible for earlier mathematicians. But the logical foundations of infinitesimals remained shaky and controversial. How could something be smaller than every positive number, yet still not be zero? What did it mean to add up infinitely many infinitesimal quantities to get a finite result? Critics like Bishop Berkeley famously derided infinitesimals as ghosts of departed quantities, mathematical objects that seemed to exist only in the minds of mathematicians who needed them for their calculations. Modern mathematics eventually gave infinitesimals a rigorous foundation through non-standard analysis, developed by Abraham Robinson in the 1960s. This showed that there are consistent mathematical universes where infinitesimal numbers exist alongside ordinary real numbers, making precise the intuitive ideas that Newton and Leibniz had used centuries earlier. Nothing, it turned out, really does come in different sizes, and mathematical systems can accommodate multiple types of nothingness without logical contradiction. Even more fundamental is the concept of identity elements in abstract algebra. Many mathematical structures contain special elements that represent doing nothing to other elements in the system. In arithmetic, adding 0 does nothing. 5 plus 0 equals 5. In geometry, rotating by 0 degrees does nothing to a shape. In logic, conjunction with a tautology does nothing to a statement's truth value. These null operations are often the most important elements in their respective systems, precisely because they preserve everything else unchanged while providing a neutral reference point for all other operations. Your mind has a complicated and often contradictory relationship with nothing that reveals fundamental aspects of how consciousness works. On one hand, you constantly encounter absence in your daily experience, missing keys, forgotten names, empty spaces where expected things should be, gaps in your memory, pauses in conversation, moments when nothing particular seems to be happening. On the other hand, your brain appears to be fundamentally designed to fill in gaps, to turn nothing into something, to populate emptiness with meaning, pattern, and narrative, even when no such meaning objectively exists. Consider the simple experience of closing your eyes right now. You might think you see nothing, just uniform darkness, the visual equivalent of silence. But if you pay careful attention to what's actually happening in your visual field, you'll notice that this darkness isn't empty or uniform at all. It swirls with shapes, colors, and patterns that seem to move and shift of their own accord. These are called phosphenes, the visual noise generated by your visual system when it's not receiving organized input from your eyes. Even when there's genuinely nothing to see, your brain creates something to perceive, manufacturing visual experience from its own internal activity. This tendency to transform nothing into something operates at the most basic levels of perception and reveals something profound about how your nervous system works. Your visual field contains a natural blind spot where your optic nerve connects to your retina, a region where you literally cannot see anything because there are no light-detecting cells present. Yet you never notice this gap in your vision because your brain fills it in seamlessly, using information from surrounding areas to create the impression of continuous sight. The nothing in your visual field gets automatically converted into something that matches the patterns around it. Similarly, when you blink, cutting off visual input dozens of times every minute, you don't perceive gaps or interruptions in your visual experience. Your brain edits out these moments of nothingness, creating the illusion of continuous seeing even though your eyes are regularly closed. The nothing that happens during blinks gets erased from consciousness, treated as if it never occurred, maintaining the fiction that you see the world continuously and without interruption. Auditory perception works in similar ways. Sit in what seems like perfect silence, and you'll gradually become aware of subtle sounds that were always there but below the threshold of attention. Your heartbeat, your breathing, the hum of electrical devices, distant traffic, the building settling around you. True silence is remarkably rare in human experience, but even in the most carefully controlled acoustic environments, many people report hearing something, often a high-pitched tone that seems to emerge from their own auditory system rather than from any external source. Psychologically, humans seem to have a deep aversion to nothingness that goes far beyond mere discomfort or preference. Studies have shown that many people would rather give themselves electric shocks than sit alone with their thoughts for just 15 minutes, with no external stimulation, no books, no phones, no activities of any kind. When faced with unstructured time and minimal sensory input, people often experience anxiety, restlessness, boredom so intense it becomes painful, or what researchers call stimulus hunger, a desperate craving for any kind of input or activity. This aversion to nothing might be evolutionary adaptive, the result of millions of years of natural selection favoring minds that remained alert and vigilant rather than resting comfortably in emptiness. A consciousness that could scan constantly for patterns, threats, opportunities, and meaningful signals would be more likely to survive than one that could settle peacefully into vacant awareness. Our ancestors, who were good at detecting the rustle in the grass that might indicate a predator, who could read significance into ambiguous environmental signs, who filled uncertain situations with cautious interpretations, were more likely to live long enough to reproduce and pass on these pattern-seeking tendencies. But this adaptive tendency to fill nothing with something can create problems when we encounter genuine randomness, meaningless events, or situations where no pattern actually exists. We see faces in clouds, hear voices in static noise, find personal significance in random coincidences, detect conspiracies in unrelated events. We're so uncomfortable with the possibility that things might be random, meaningless, or simply absent that we often impose patterns and meanings where none exist, creating elaborate somethings from pure nothings, simply because our minds cannot rest comfortably in uncertainty or absence. Different meditation traditions have long recognized this psychological quirk and developed practices specifically designed to help people become more comfortable with various forms of emptiness. Many meditative techniques involve learning to rest in mental spaces that conventional consciousness finds uncomfortable: empty awareness, gaps between thoughts, silence without content, presence without objects. This isn't about thinking about nothing, which is practically impossible, but about discovering the spacious awareness in which all thoughts, sensations, and experiences arise and pass away. The relationship between psychology and nothing becomes particularly complex when we consider states like depression and anxiety, which often involve distorted relationships with absence and emptiness. People experiencing depression frequently describe feeling empty, hollow, drained, as if something essential has been removed from their inner life. But this isn't the peaceful emptiness sought in meditation. It's a painful absence of meaning, motivation, pleasure, or emotional connection. The nothing of depression feels like a wound, a lack that demands to be filled but resists all attempts at satisfaction. Anxiety often involves the opposite problem: an inability to tolerate uncertainty, the unknown, the not yet determined aspects of experience. The anxious mind compulsively fills gaps in knowledge with worst-case scenarios, populates unknown futures with imagined catastrophes, treats any absence of information as a space that must be immediately occupied by fearful projections. Nothing becomes terrifying not because it's empty, but because it could potentially become anything, and the anxious imagination gravitates toward the most frightening possibilities it can generate. Creativity presents yet another relationship with nothing that reveals different aspects of psychological functioning. The blank page, the empty canvas, the silence before the first note of a composition. These apparent voids are not problems to be solved, but spaces of pure possibility. Creative people often describe learning to be comfortable with not knowing, with sitting in uncertainty and confusion until something authentic wants to emerge from the emptiness. They develop skills for inhabiting the nothing productively, using absence as a generative space rather than a gap that needs immediate filling. Even the experience of boredom reveals complex psychological relationships with nothing. What we call boredom isn't usually the complete absence of stimulation, but rather the presence of insufficient stimulation, the gap between what our attention system wants and what the environment provides. The bored mind often generates its own activity, daydreaming, fantasizing, or creating internal narratives to fill the experiential void. Some psychologists argue that boredom serves important functions, motivating us to seek new experiences and preventing us from becoming too comfortable with unstimulating situations. So psychologically, nothing is never simply nothing. It's always a space your mind fills with perception, interpretation, anxiety, creativity, or meaning-making activity of some kind. Understanding your personal relationship with emptiness, silence, uncertainty, boredom, and the unknown reveals fundamental aspects of how your consciousness operates and how you navigate a world that's full of gaps your mind is constantly working to understand, fill, or bridge. If you've ever tried meditation, you've probably encountered one of the most persistent misconceptions about the practice, that it's about emptying your mind, thinking of nothing, achieving a state of blank awareness devoid of any mental content. Experienced meditators often smile at this description because, as anyone who has actually spent time sitting quietly with their own mind knows, trying to think of nothing is like trying not to think of a pink elephant. The harder you try to empty your thoughts, the more crowded your mind becomes with the effort of emptying, the more aware you become of every fleeting mental movement, every subtle sensation, every tiny distraction. Yet there is something profound happening in meditation that relates to nothing, though it's far more subtle and paradoxical than simply turning off your thoughts like switching off a radio. Meditation practices often involve developing a fundamentally different relationship with the space in which thoughts arise, the awareness itself that is always present but usually overlooked because we're so completely absorbed in the contents of our experience, rather than the context that makes experience possible. Think of your mind as a vast sky stretching endlessly in all directions. Thoughts, emotions, sensations, and perceptions are like clouds, weather patterns, birds flying through that space. Most of the time, we identify completely with the weather, saying, "I am angry," "I am worried," "I am thinking about what to have for lunch," as if we were the temporary phenomena, rather than the unchanging sky in which they appear. Meditation can reveal this sky-like awareness that contains all experiences without being fundamentally altered by any of them. A spacious consciousness that remains present whether the weather is stormy or calm. Different meditation traditions approach this relationship with emptiness through various methods, each offering unique insights into the nature of mental space. Zen Buddhism speaks of emptiness or shunyata, not as a blank void, but as the absence of inherent, separate, independent existence. Everything appears, everything functions, but nothing exists as a solid, isolated, permanent entity. This isn't philosophical speculation, but something practitioners report experiencing directly during meditation. The dissolution of the usual sense of separation between observer and observed, subject and object, self and world. Vipassana, or insight meditation, often involves cultivating precise attention to the gaps and spaces that usually go unnoticed. The brief pause between one breath and the next, the moment of stillness that appears between thoughts, the instant of silence that occurs between sounds. These gaps aren't absent experiences. They're a different quality of experiencing altogether, a pure awareness that's usually overshadowed by more dramatic mental events like planning, analyzing, remembering, or problem-solving. Practitioners learn to recognize these spaces not as empty holes in their experience, but as the natural resting place of consciousness itself. The gap between thoughts isn't a vacancy waiting to be filled. It's awareness without an object, mind resting in its own nature without needing to focus on any particular content. This recognition can be profoundly restful, like discovering a quiet room in your house that you never knew existed. Mantra meditation uses a completely different approach that paradoxically leads to similar discoveries about mental emptiness. By giving the mind something very specific to focus on, a word, phrase, or sound repeated continuously, practitioners often discover the spacious silence in which the mantra appears and disappears. The repetition becomes a doorway into stillness rather than an end in itself, a technique for using sound to reveal the silence that contains all sounds. Contemplative traditions describe various stages or qualities of emptiness that can be encountered in deep meditative states. There's the emptiness of mental quietude, when the usual stream of thoughts temporarily slows or stops altogether. There's the emptiness of expanded awareness, when the boundaries of personal identity soften and consciousness seems to merge with a larger field of being. And there's the emptiness of pure presence, when even the sense of being someone having an experience dissolves into simple, immediate, unbounded awareness. These experiences can be profoundly peaceful and refreshing, but they can also be disorienting or even frightening for people who aren't prepared for them psychologically. The ego mind, which is accustomed to being busy and important, maintaining the story of personal identity and managing the complexities of daily life, can react with anxiety or panic when it discovers that it might not be as solid, necessary, or permanent as it assumed. Some traditions specifically warn about becoming attached to empty states, treating them as spiritual achievements rather than natural expressions of consciousness temporarily free from its usual preoccupations. Neuroscience has begun studying what happens in the brain during these meditative encounters with emptiness, providing fascinating correlations between subjective reports and objective measurements. Advanced practitioners show characteristic changes in the default mode network, the brain regions associated with self-referential thinking, autobiographical memory, and the mental activities that maintain our sense of being a separate self moving through time. During states of selfless awareness or profound mental quiet, activity in these regions often decreases significantly. Some studies suggest that the subjective experience of dissolving boundaries corresponds to reduced activity in areas of the brain responsible for maintaining the distinction between self and environment. The experience of timeless presence correlates with changes in regions that normally track temporal sequence and duration. These findings don't explain consciousness or prove that meditative experiences are just brain states, but they do suggest that the nothing encountered in meditation involves genuine neurological shifts rather than mere imagination or suggestion. Perhaps the most practical insight that emerges from meditative exploration of nothing is the recognition that emptiness and fullness aren't opposites but different aspects of the same phenomenon. Experienced practitioners often describe empty awareness as incredibly full, rich with presence, saturated with an unconditional okayness that doesn't depend on circumstances or content. It's not that nothing is there in these states. It's that what's there is so fundamental, so basic to the nature of consciousness itself, that it usually remains invisible beneath the more dramatic activities of thinking, feeling, and perceiving. This has implications that extend far beyond formal meditation practice. Learning to be comfortable with not knowing, with uncertainty, with the spaces between thoughts and activities, can transform daily life in subtle but significant ways. Instead of reflexively filling every moment of silence with conversation, every gap in the schedule with activities, every pause with mental analysis, you might discover that emptiness itself can be nourishing, creative, and deeply restful. The nothing that meditation reveals isn't a blank slate or an absent void, but rather the pregnant fullness of present moment awareness, always available regardless of circumstances, never needing to be achieved or maintained because it's already the most basic fact of conscious existence, as natural and immediate as the space in which all experiences arise and dissolve. Artists and writers have long been fascinated by nothing, finding it a surprisingly rich subject for creative exploration that challenges conventional assumptions about content, meaning, and aesthetic value. Far from being simply the absence of subject matter, nothing in art becomes a powerful presence, a silence that speaks volumes, an emptiness that overflows with significance and emotional resonance. The artistic exploration of nothingness reveals dimensions of human experience that can't be captured through representation, narrative, or conventional symbolic systems. Consider the white space on a page or canvas, what art theorists call negative space. To an untrained observer, these areas might seem like wasted opportunities, regions where the artist simply didn't put anything, gaps that could have been filled with more content, more detail, more visual information. But artists understand negative space as an active compositional element that shapes meaning as powerfully as any positive mark or form. The emptiness between elements creates relationships, guides the viewer's attention, provides visual rest and breathing room, establishes rhythm and balance. In traditional Chinese and Japanese painting, The unpainted areas often represent natural phenomena like mist, water, clouds, or sky, not because the artist was economizing effort or materials, but because emptiness itself can be more expressive and evocative than any amount of detailed rendering. A few brush strokes suggesting mountains emerging from fog can convey the vastness and mystery of a landscape more effectively than a meticulously detailed photographic representation. The viewer's imagination completes the image, participating in the creative act by filling the suggestive emptiness with their own experience and associations. Japanese aesthetics has developed particularly sophisticated approaches to meaningful nothingness through concepts like ma, often inadequately translated as negative space or interval. Ma refers to the profound quietness between things, the pregnant pause that gives structure and meaning to what surrounds it. It appears in the silence between musical notes that creates rhythm and emotional tension, the empty spaces in architectural design that allow inhabitants to breathe and contemplate, the pause in conversation that adds weight and significance to words. The traditional Japanese tea ceremony exemplifies this aesthetic philosophy through its careful orchestration of emptiness alongside activity. Much of the ceremony's beauty and spiritual significance lies not in elaborate decoration or complex procedures, but in the thoughtful arrangement of simple objects within carefully considered empty spaces. The ceremony celebrates the emptiness of the tea bowl before it's filled, honoring the void as an essential aspect of the vessel's function and meaning. Participants learn to appreciate silence before words are spoken, stillness that frames each deliberate movement, the spacious awareness that contains and gives significance to each ritual gesture. Literature has developed its own sophisticated methods for working creatively with nothing, using absence as a compositional tool that can be more powerful than presence. Samuel Beckett's plays, particularly Waiting for Godot, are masterpieces of meaningful nothingness that reveal profound truths about the human condition through what doesn't happen rather than what does. Two characters wait throughout the entire play for someone who never arrives, engaging in circular conversations that lead nowhere, performing small actions that accomplish nothing in terms of conventional dramatic progress. Yet these plays are deeply moving and psychologically penetrating precisely because they capture something essential about human existence: our tendency to create meaning and purpose in apparently meaningless situations, our ability to form connections and find humor even when facing uncertainty and disappointment, our persistence in the face of apparent futility. Beckett shows us that nothing happening can be more dramatically interesting and emotionally resonant than the most elaborate plot developments. Music depends fundamentally on various forms of nothing to create its effects. The pause before a symphony begins creates anticipation and focuses attention. The spaces between notes give them definition and allow melodies to breathe. Rhythm emerges from the interplay between sound and silence, creating patterns that exist as much in the gaps as in the beats. John Cage's controversial composition, 433, consists entirely of silence, or rather, it reveals that complete silence never actually exists. The piece directs attention to ambient sounds that are always present but usually ignored: the breathing of the audience, subtle environmental noises, the acoustic characteristics of the performance space itself. Writers use various forms of emptiness as essential structural elements. White space, line breaks, paragraph divisions, and chapter endings create rhythm and pacing that can be as important as the words themselves. The gap between scenes or sections can be more dramatically powerful than explicit description, allowing readers to fill narrative spaces with their own imagination and emotional response. Ernest Hemingway's famous iceberg theory suggests that the most powerful stories reveal only a small portion of their total meaning on the surface, with the greater part of the story's emotional and thematic content existing in what's left unsaid, implied, or suggested rather than directly stated. Abstract art pushed the exploration of nothing even further by eliminating representational content entirely, creating works that appeared to be pure color, form, or texture without depicting recognizable objects or scenes. Painters like Yves Klein who developed his own distinctive shade called International Klein Blue, created canvases that seemed to be nothing but color, yet viewers often report profound and moving experiences when contemplating these apparently simple works. The absence of representational content somehow creates space for a different kind of seeing, a more direct encounter with color, texture, and spatial relationships. Minimalism in various art forms embraces nothing as a fundamental aesthetic principle, operating on the conviction that less can indeed become more through careful reduction and refinement. By systematically removing decorative elements, narrative content, and visual complexity, minimalist artists direct attention to essential relationships, materials, and forms that might otherwise be overlooked. The empty gallery space becomes as compositionally important as the few objects displayed within it, creating an environment where every element gains significance through its relationship to the surrounding emptiness. Contemporary installation artists often work directly with emptiness as their primary medium, creating spaces that appear vacant but generate powerful emotional or psychological responses in visitors. These works challenge conventional assumptions about art as object making, instead creating experiences of absence that can be more memorable and transformative than encounters with traditional artworks. The emptiness in these installations isn't vacant or meaningless, but carefully structured and intentionally charged with potential, inviting viewers to confront their own relationships with absence, silence, and void. Even comedy relies heavily on strategic deployment of nothing through timing, pause, and misdirection. The pause before a punchline creates suspense and amplifies the humorous impact. The gap between audience expectation and actual outcome generates surprise and laughter. Comedic timing is largely about managing emptiness skillfully, knowing when to pause, when to leave space for audience response, when to let silence do the comedic work that words cannot accomplish. All of these artistic explorations suggest that nothing is far from empty when it comes to creative expression and aesthetic experience. Artists understand intuitively what philosophers and scientists struggle to articulate through abstract analysis, that emptiness is not the absence of meaning, but a different kind of meaning altogether. Not a lack of content, but a unique form of content that can be more emotionally powerful and intellectually stimulating than any amount of conventional representation or explicit information. Here we encounter one of the most delightful logical knots in human thinking, a puzzle that has entertained and frustrated philosophers for centuries. How do you define nothing without turning it into something? The moment you start talking about nothing, describing its properties, explaining its characteristics, analyzing its nature, you seem to be treating it as if it were something after all. It's like trying to photograph darkness, or weigh silence, or measure the temperature of emptiness. The very act of investigation appears to change fundamentally what you're trying to investigate, creating the thing you're claiming doesn't exist. Language creates immediate and unavoidable problems when we attempt to discuss nothingness. The word nothing is obviously something, a sound when spoken, a pattern of marks when written, a concept in your mind when you think about it. When you say nothing, you're referring to something specific, even if that something is supposedly the complete absence of everything. Philosophers call this the problem of negative existentials. How can you make true statements about things that don't exist? How can you refer to what isn't there? What exactly are you pointing to when you point to nothing? Consider the apparently simple sentence, "There is nothing in the box." This seems straightforward enough in everyday conversation, but logically, it creates puzzling complications that have occupied some of the finest minds in philosophy. If there's genuinely nothing in the box, what exactly are you referring to when you use the word nothing? Are you somehow naming an absence? Can absences be named in the same way that presences can? And if nothing is in the box, how can there simultaneously be nothing in the box? Isn't that putting something called nothing into the box, which would mean the box isn't empty after all? These aren't just clever wordplay tricks or academic exercises in logical hair-splitting. They point to genuine difficulties in how language relates to reality, how concepts relate to existence, how our mental categories map onto the actual structure of the world. Different languages handle this paradox in various ways, revealing that our relationship with nothingness is partly shaped by the linguistic tools available to us for thinking and talking about absence. Some languages don't have a direct equivalent to the English word nothing. Instead, they use constructions like not anything or no thing, which makes the logical structure clearer but doesn't entirely dissolve the underlying problem. You're still somehow referring to absence as if it were a kind of presence. Other languages have multiple words for different types of absence, emptiness or void, allowing for more nuanced discussions of various forms of nothingness. But more vocabulary doesn't solve the fundamental paradox. It just creates more sophisticated versions of the same basic problem. Formal logic has wrestled with these issues since ancient times, developing various technical approaches to handle statements about non-existent things. In modern predicate logic, existence is treated as a property that some things possess and others lack. But this immediately creates new puzzles. What is it that lacks the property of existence? How can we quantify over things that don't exist? If we say there are things that don't exist, are we contradicting ourselves by asserting the existence of non-existent entities? Some philosophers, most famously Alexius Meinong in the early 20th century, proposed that there must be different modes or degrees of being. Some things exist in full reality, like chairs and trees and people. Other things subsist in a shadowy realm of possibility or impossibility, like fictional characters, impossible objects, or abstract concepts. In this view, nothing would be a special kind of something, a subsistent object that lacks the property of full existence. This preserves our ability to think and talk coherently about nothing, but at the cost of populating the universe with a vast realm of non-existent entities that somehow have enough being to be discussed and analyzed. Other philosophers, following Bertrand Russell's influential approach, argued that statements about nothing should be analyzed differently to avoid these metaphysical complications. There is nothing in the box doesn't really refer to a mysterious entity called nothing. It's just an economical way of saying it's not the case that there is something in the box. This logical analysis dissolves the apparent paradox by showing that we're not really referring to nothing at all. When we make negative statements, we're just making claims about what isn't the case rather than what is. But even this elegant solution creates new problems. If statements about nothing don't actually refer to nothing, then what are we talking about right now in this exploration of nothingness? How can we explain why some people find the idea of pure emptiness frightening while others find it peaceful if there's no it to have emotional responses to? How can physicists study vacuums, mathematicians work with empty sets, or meditation practitioners explore experiences of emptiness if there's nothing there to study or experience? The paradox becomes even more complex when we consider nothing as a philosophical or scientific concept that has played crucial roles in human intellectual development. Clearly, thinkers throughout history have been investigating something when they investigated nothing, discovering genuine insights, developing useful theories, making important distinctions. Are they studying something or nothing? If they're studying nothing, how can nothing be an object of study? If they're studying something, then whatever they call nothing isn't really nothing at all. This isn't merely academic wordplay with no practical consequences. The paradox points to something fundamental about how thought, language, and conceptual understanding operate. We seem to need positive concepts, definite mental objects that we can grasp and manipulate cognitively, even when we're trying to think about absence, lack, or emptiness. Our minds appear to be built for detecting and categorizing presences rather than absences, things rather than non-things, somethings rather than nothings. The paradox itself might be revealing something important about the nature of nothing that can't be captured through straightforward definition or analysis. Maybe the fact that we can't pin down nothing precisely, can't define it without contradiction, can't study it without somehow changing its essential character, is exactly the point. Nothing might be paradoxical by its very nature, not by accident or due to limitations in our thinking, but because paradox is intrinsic to what nothingness actually is. Perhaps the most honest and intellectually humble approach is to acknowledge the paradox openly, rather than trying to solve it through clever logical maneuvers or metaphysical speculation. Nothing might be something that can be approached, circled around, experienced, explored, and contemplated, but never fully captured in concepts, definitions, or words. Like trying to grab your own shadow or catch your reflection in a mirror, the harder you reach for nothing directly, the more it slips away from your conceptual grasp, leaving you holding only ideas and language, which are, paradoxically and inevitably, something rather than nothing after all. In our digital age, nothing has found entirely new forms of expression and significance that would have been incomprehensible to earlier generations of philosophers and scientists. Every piece of information in your computer, every photo on your phone, every word in this script, every video you stream, exists fundamentally as patterns of something and nothing, ones and zeros, presence and absence of electrical signals, tiny magnetic orientations representing binary states of being and not being. The entire digital revolution rests on increasingly sophisticated methods for organizing and manipulating these basic relationships between something and nothing. The zero in binary code isn't quite the same as mathematical zero, though they share important conceptual DNA. In binary systems, zero typically represents the absence of an electrical signal, a switch in the off position, a magnetic domain oriented in one direction rather than another, a microscopic pit on a disk surface rather than a raised area. It's not pure nothingness in any philosophical sense, but rather one of two possible states, defined entirely through its relationship to its opposite. This digital nothing has substance and requires energy to maintain, store, and process. This leads to a fascinating property of digital nothingness. It takes up exactly the same amount of physical space and computational resources as digital somethingness. Every zero in your computer's memory occupies the same amount of storage as a one. Your device works just as hard to process, transmit, and maintain zeros as ones. In digital systems, nothing and something are treated as complete equals, given identical resources and importance. Absence becomes as substantial and significant as presence, requiring the same infrastructure and energy to exist. But digital systems also create entirely new categories of nothing that have no analog in physical reality. When you delete a file from your computer, what actually happens to that information? In most cases, the data isn't immediately erased or destroyed. Instead, the system simply marks that storage space as available for new data and stops keeping track of what's currently stored there. The deleted information might persist for days, weeks, or months until it's gradually overwritten by new files. Digital deletion often doesn't create true nothingness, but rather a kind of technological amnesia, a systematic forgetting rather than actual erasing. Professional data recovery services exploit this gap between apparent deletion and actual destruction, often retrieving files that users believed were permanently gone. The nothing created by deletion turns out to be a temporary nothing, an organizational nothing rather than a physical nothing. Your deleted photos might still exist on your storage device, even though your operating system behaves as if they don't exist. It's a peculiar form of digital limbo where information exists and doesn't exist simultaneously. The internet itself is constructed on a foundation that's mostly nothing, a vast addressing system where most possible locations lead to emptiness. Every website has a unique address, but there are far more possible web addresses than actual websites. Most random combinations of letters and numbers in a URL format lead nowhere. Error pages, failed connections, digital dead ends. The internet's address space is predominantly empty, like an enormous city where most street numbers don't correspond to actual buildings, where most coordinates point to vacant lots. This emptiness isn't accidental or wasteful. It's essential for the system's flexibility and growth. The vast spaces of unused addresses provide room for expansion, allow for complex routing and organization schemes, enable the creation of new sites without conflicts. The internet works partly because it's mostly nothing, because there's so much empty space between the actual content that information can find efficient paths and users can create new addresses without running out of available options. Virtual and augmented reality systems create perhaps the most philosophically interesting relationships with digital nothing. VR environments can generate convincing experiences of spaces that don't physically exist, objects that aren't actually there, entire worlds built from nothing but patterns of light on screens and carefully timed sensory inputs. When you reach out to touch a virtual object and your hand passes through empty air, which experience is more real? The visual and auditory information suggesting an object is present, or the tactile feedback confirming that nothing is actually there? These technologies force us to reconsider what we mean by presence and absence, reality and illusion, something and nothing. A virtual mountain that you can see, walk around, and explore might feel more real than many physical objects you encounter briefly. The nothing of empty space becomes filled with convincing simulations that can trigger genuine emotional and physiological responses. Fear of virtual heights, excitement about virtual achievements, attachment to virtual possessions. These responses treat digital nothings as if they were substantial somethings. Artificial intelligence systems have developed their own complex relationships with nothing through machine learning processes that must distinguish signal from noise, pattern from randomness, meaningful data from irrelevant information. AI algorithms often work by learning to recognize what isn't significant just as much as what is, developing sophisticated abilities to ignore irrelevant data, filter out noise, and focus on meaningful patterns. In a sense, artificial intelligence systems must learn to perceive nothing accurately in order to better identify something important. The concept of null values in programming represents a particularly precise form of digital nothing. Null isn't 0, is a specific value, while null represents the complete absence of any value whatsoever. Programming languages handle null in different ways, and much of software debugging involves dealing with unexpected encounters with these digital nothings. When a program tries to use a value that isn't there, when it expects something but finds null instead, chaos often ensues in the form of crashes, errors, or unpredictable behavior. Data compression algorithms work by finding more efficient ways to represent information, often by recognizing and eliminating redundancy, repetition, and predictable patterns. In a sense, compression systems are experts at finding the hidden nothing within something, the unnecessary repetitions, the predictable sequences that don't need to be explicitly stored, the redundant information that can be removed without loss. A perfectly compressed file contains no internal nothingness, no wasted space, no superfluous data. But compression also raises profound questions about the relationship between information and nothingness. If you can compress data significantly without losing information, was the extra space really necessary in the first place? Or was it a kind of technological padding, digital emptiness that we mistook for meaningful content? The ability to compress suggests that much of what we take to be substantial digital content might actually be structured nothing, patterns of repetition and predictability that can be replaced by much more concise mathematical descriptions. Even the fundamental operations that make computers possible, logic gates processing information according to Boolean algebra, can be understood as sophisticated methods for manipulating relationships between presence and absence, true and false, something and nothing. Every calculation, every display of text or images, every digital interaction emerges from countless microscopic decisions between binary alternatives, each representing a choice between something and nothing at the most basic level of computer operation. So in our digital world, nothing has become highly structured, carefully managed, and surprisingly productive. Digital nothing isn't the wild, chaotic void that ancient philosophers feared, but rather domesticated nothingness, engineered emptiness. Nothing that has been put to work, serving human purposes and technological needs. Nothing, it turns out, can be quite valuable in economic terms, revealing how scarcity creates market opportunities and how absence itself can become a commodity. In modern economies, people regularly pay premium prices for various forms of nothingness: the absence of crowds at exclusive retreats, the elimination of noise through soundproofing, the removal of distractions in digital detox programs, the creation of empty space in minimalist design. What businesses are selling isn't stuff but the carefully curated absence of stuff, and consumers pay handsomely for access to these engineered voids. Consider the luxury market for emptiness that has emerged in response to our increasingly crowded, noisy, stimulating world. High-end hotels advertise their quietest rooms, promising guests the absence of urban sounds, traffic noise, and human activity. Exclusive resorts market their emptiness as a selling point. Uncrowded beaches, private wilderness areas, spaces where you're guaranteed not to encounter other tourists. The scarcity being sold is the absence of other people, the promise of experiencing places without the usual human density that makes them less desirable. Cities recognize the economic value of empty space through urban planning that treats parks, plazas, and green belts as economic assets rather than unused land. These spaces provide no direct commercial output, generate no rent or sales revenue, produce no tangible goods. Yet they consistently increase property values throughout surrounding areas, attract businesses and residents, improve quality of life in ways that translate into measurable economic benefits. Empty space, properly managed and strategically located, becomes one of the most valuable components of urban economic development. The attention economy has transformed mental emptiness into an increasingly scarce and valuable resource. In a world of constant notifications, endless social media feeds, 24-hour news cycles, and perpetual connectivity, an empty mind becomes rare and precious. Meditation apps, mindfulness courses, digital detox retreats, and focus enhancement services all monetize various forms of mental nothingness. They're selling the absence of distraction, the pause between thoughts, the quiet space where attention can rest without being pulled toward competing stimuli. Subscription services often profit substantially from purchased but unused access, a business model that depends partly on customers paying for nothing. When you maintain a gym membership you rarely use, a streaming service you barely watch, or a software subscription you've forgotten about, companies benefit from your unused consumption. They've sold you potential that remains unrealized, capacity that stays empty, access that goes unacknowledged. The most profitable customers are often those who pay regularly for services they don't actually consume. Data storage economics revolve entirely around selling organized nothingness. Cloud storage companies market empty space, gigabytes and terabytes of void waiting to be filled with your photos, documents, videos, and files. They're literally commercializing emptiness, selling you vacant digital real estate that becomes valuable only when you fill it with your information. The business model depends on having vast amounts of unused capacity available, maintaining enormous empty spaces that can be allocated to customers as needed. Advertising markets operate on similar principles, treating empty space as valuable real estate. A blank billboard isn't worthless. It represents potential energy waiting to be converted into attention, influence, and consumer behavior. Premium advertising locations command high prices, not for what they contain, but for what they could contain, for their capacity to hold messages that will be seen by specific demographics. The emptiness itself has quantifiable value based on traffic patterns, visibility, and audience characteristics. Financial markets have created sophisticated instruments for trading various forms of nothing. Short selling involves profiting from the absence of value, betting that stocks will decline, and making money when companies lose worth rather than gain it. Options trading creates contracts for future possibilities that may never materialize, generating profits from price movements that might not occur. Derivatives markets allow investors to bet on the relationships between assets, without owning the underlying assets themselves. Insurance represents perhaps the purest economic form of nothing, an industry built entirely on selling protection against events that ideally never happen. You pay premiums for coverage against accidents, illnesses, disasters, and losses that you hope to never experience. If you're fortunate, you receive nothing tangible for your payments. No claims, no payouts, no services, just the peace of mind that comes from knowing you're protected against potential misfortunes. The insurance industry profits by providing security against nothings that might become somethings, selling absence of financial risk rather than presence of material goods. Intellectual property law creates artificial scarcity around information that could naturally be copied infinitely at virtually no cost. Copyright and patent systems take ideas, which want to be free and abundant, and impose legal frameworks that make them scarce and valuable. The economics of information goods often involves finding ways to monetize things that naturally resist monetization, creating property rights over concepts, expressions, and innovations that exist primarily as patterns rather than physical objects. Social safety nets and unemployment benefits represent economic systems specifically designed for managing productive nothingness. These programs provide resources precisely when work isn't available, supporting people during gaps in employment, cushioning societies against the economic voids that inevitably appear in complex market systems. They monetize the absence of opportunity, ensuring that people can survive economically even when they have nothing immediate to contribute to productive activity. The sharing economy has discovered new methods for monetizing temporary emptiness by transforming idle resources into active economic assets. Unused cars become ride shares, empty rooms become short-term rentals, spare time becomes gig work, vacant parking spaces become hourly rentals. These platforms profit by filling temporary nothings with economic activity, turning brief periods of idleness into productive, revenue-generating time. Even carbon offset markets trade in carefully measured nothings: the absence of emissions, the prevention of pollution that would otherwise occur, the creation of environmental voids where harmful gases would typically be released. Companies and individuals pay for certified absences, purchasing guarantees that specific amounts of carbon dioxide will not enter the atmosphere, treating environmental nothingness as a commodity that can be bought, sold, and regulated. Different cultures have dramatically different relationships with nothing that reveal how deeply our understanding of emptiness is shaped by social context, historical experience, religious tradition, and collective meaning-making systems. These cultural variations in approaching nothingness aren't merely academic curiosities. They influence daily behavior, emotional responses, creative expression, and fundamental assumptions about what constitutes a meaningful life. In many Western cultures, particularly those influenced by Protestant work ethics and industrial capitalism, emptiness often carries negative connotations that seem almost instinctive. Empty time is frequently viewed as wasted time, empty space as unused potential, empty minds as idle and therefore potentially dangerous. The phrase "the devil makes work for idle hands" captures this cultural anxiety about unproductive emptiness. We reflexively fill silence with conversation, empty moments with activities, contemplative pauses with goal-directed tasks, as if emptiness itself were somehow morally suspect or psychologically unhealthy. This cultural discomfort with nothingness appears in language patterns, social expectations, and economic structures. We speak of spending time as if it were currency, saving time as if it could be stored, wasting time as if emptiness were inherently inefficient. Social interactions often involve elaborate protocols for avoiding uncomfortable silences, filling conversational gaps with small talk, weather commentary, or questions that keep information flowing rather than allowing natural pauses to develop. Eastern philosophical and religious traditions often present fundamentally different relationships with various forms of emptiness. In Buddhism, the concept of shunyata, or emptiness, isn't a negative condition to be avoided, but a fundamental characteristic of reality that, when properly understood, leads to wisdom and liberation. This emptiness doesn't mean that things don't exist, but rather that nothing exists independently, permanently, or with fixed inherent nature. Understanding emptiness becomes a spiritual goal rather than a problem to be solved. Traditional Japanese aesthetics has developed multiple sophisticated approaches to appreciating and cultivating meaningful nothingness. The concept of ma, which we've touched on before, represents far more than simple negative space. It's the meaningful pause that gives structure to music, conversation, and visual composition. Ma is the silence that makes sound possible, the emptiness that gives form to architecture, the stillness that makes movement significant. Japanese garden design often emphasizes what isn't there as much as what is, using empty spaces to create contemplative environments where absence becomes a positive aesthetic experience. Wabi-sabi, another Japanese aesthetic principle, finds beauty in incompleteness, imperfection, and impermanence. This philosophy appreciates the gaps and absences that reveal the transient nature of all phenomena. A cracked tea bowl, a weathered wooden post, a garden where plants have died and left empty spaces. These aren't failures or problems, but expressions of natural processes that deserve appreciation rather than correction. The nothing that appears through wear, age, and natural decay becomes aesthetically valuable rather than something to be hidden or repaired. Indigenous Australian concepts of country include vast landscapes that might appear empty or barren to outsider perspectives, but are understood by Aboriginal cultures as densely meaningful, filled with stories, spiritual presences, and complex relationships that aren't immediately visible to those without appropriate cultural knowledge. What looks like nothing empty desert, sparse vegetation, uninhabited terrain contains rich networks of meaning, ancestral presence, and navigational information that have sustained communities for tens of thousands of years. Arctic cultures have developed intricate relationships with what might seem like monotonous emptiness, vast expanses of ice, snow, and tundra that appear uniform and featureless to people from more temperate climates. But these cultures distinguish dozens of different snow conditions, ice formations, wind patterns, and weather systems, finding in apparent sameness a rich vocabulary of environmental difference. They've learned to read meaning, direction, and survival information in landscapes that others might dismiss as empty or unchanging. Religious traditions vary dramatically in their approaches to spiritual emptiness and the role of nothingness in religious experience. Christian mystical traditions often describe periods of spiritual dryness or dark nights of the soul as necessary stages in religious development, times when the usual consolations and certainties are absent, but which serve important purifying functions. Some Christian contemplatives seek experiences of emptiness as ways of making space for divine presence, emptying themselves of personal will and desire to become receptive to spiritual guidance. Islamic mysticism explores concepts like fana, a form of mystical annihilation where individual ego dissolves into divine unity. This isn't viewed as destruction, but as fulfillment, the removal of the false self that separates the individual from ultimate reality. The nothing that results from this spiritual emptying becomes the space where authentic being can emerge, freed from the limitations of separate selfhood. Hindu traditions include practices of sense withdrawal and mental emptying designed to reveal the unchanging awareness that exists beyond all particular experiences. The goal isn't to remain in empty states permanently, but to discover the consciousness that's present whether experience is full or empty, active or quiet. This emptiness becomes a doorway to understanding the nature of awareness itself rather than an end in itself. Conversely, some religious and cultural traditions emphasize fullness, abundance, and active engagement over contemplative emptiness. Certain Christian theologies stress the richness of divine creation and the importance of filling life with good works, charitable activity, and community involvement, rather than seeking solitary emptiness. Some forms of Judaism emphasize the value of filling existence with mitzvot, study, and religious observance, rather than pursuing states of mental vacancy or withdrawal from worldly engagement. Cultural attitudes toward death reveal profound differences in relationships with ultimate nothingness. Some cultures view death as a passage to continued existence in different form, others as a return to the undifferentiated source from which life emerged, still others as complete termination that gives urgency and meaning to present existence. These different perspectives on final nothingness shape how people approach daily life, moral decision-making, and the significance they assign to temporal versus eternal concerns. Even cultural approaches to boredom and leisure time vary significantly across different societies and historical periods. Some cultures treat boredom as a luxury that indicates freedom from survival pressures, others as a problem requiring immediate solution through entertainment and stimulation, still others as a potentially creative state that can lead to insight, artistic expression, or spiritual development. Language itself shapes cultural relationships with nothingness through the availability of vocabulary for different types of absence, emptiness, or void. Languages with multiple words for various forms of nothing allow for more nuanced cultural discussions about these experiences, while languages that collapse these distinctions into single concepts may encourage different ways of thinking about presence and absence. Perhaps the most mysterious relationship with nothing exists in consciousness itself, in the very awareness that makes all experience possible. Your consciousness seems to be the space in which all mental phenomena appear, thoughts arising and dissolving, sensations coming and going, emotions emerging and fading, perceptions forming and disappearing. But when you try to examine consciousness directly, when you attempt to look at awareness itself rather than its contents, you often encounter something remarkably similar to nothing, yet paradoxically full of potential. This isn't the nothing of absence or vacancy, but a peculiar kind of transparency, a spacious openness that can accommodate any experience without being fundamentally altered by what it contains. It's like trying to see the mirror rather than the reflections it displays, or attempting to observe the screen rather than the images projected upon it. Consciousness appears to have no fixed characteristics of its own, no inherent color or texture or shape, yet it makes all colors, textures, and shapes possible. Neuroscience approaches consciousness from the opposite direction, studying the brain mechanisms that correlate with our sense of being aware, awake, and experiencing. Here, too, nothing plays curious roles that challenge our assumptions about the relationship between mind and brain. The brain's default mode network, most active when we're not focused on specific tasks or external stimuli, has been associated with self-referential thinking, autobiographical memory, and the mental activities that maintain our sense of personal identity across time. When this default network quiets during deep meditation, anesthesia, or certain altered states of consciousness, people often report experiences of selflessness, ego dissolution, or the temporary disappearance of the usual sense of being someone separate from the world. These experiences suggest that what we typically take to be our solid, continuous self might depend on specific patterns of brain activity that can be interrupted or modified. Some neuroscientists propose that consciousness itself might be more like nothing than something in the conventional sense. Rather than being a thing the brain produces, consciousness might be what appears when certain restrictive brain processes temporarily cease operation. In this view, awareness is what's there when the brain stops filtering, categorizing, and interpreting raw sensory input, like a clear sky that becomes visible when clouds disperse. The phenomenon of general anesthesia provides another window into the relationship between consciousness and nothingness. Under surgical anesthesia, there's typically no sense of time passing, no dreams or mental activity that can be recalled, no awareness of any kind. It's as if several hours of existence simply don't happen from the perspective of the person undergoing surgery. People commonly describe it as different from sleep, not as an altered state of consciousness, but as the complete temporary absence of consciousness altogether. Yet somehow you survive this gap of nothing, and wake up feeling like the same person who went under anesthesia hours earlier. This suggests something puzzling about the continuity of identity across periods of unconsciousness. What maintains the sense of self during intervals when no self seems to be present? How does personal identity bridge gaps of nothingness that contain no apparent experience or memory? Sleep itself involves regular encounters with various forms of mental nothingness. Deep sleep stages involve minimal conscious awareness, yet we don't experience this absence as frightening emptiness while we're in it. We simply don't experience it as anything at all. Only retrospectively do we recognize these gaps in experience, these nightly journeys into temporary unconsciousness that somehow refresh and restore us. Dreams present additional puzzles about consciousness and its relationship to substantial reality. Dream experiences can feel completely convincing while we're having them, yet they're constructed from nothing but neural activity, memory fragments, and unconscious processing. Dream objects have no physical substance. Dream environments exist nowhere in space. Dream people are assembled from imagination and recollection. Yet the experience of dreaming often feels as immediate and real as waking consciousness. The hard problem of consciousness, as philosophers call it, involves understanding how subjective experience arises from objective brain processes. How does the gray matter in your skull create the vivid, immediate, private world of your conscious experience? How do neural firings become the felt sense of seeing red, tasting chocolate, feeling sad, or remembering childhood? Some philosophers suggest this explanatory gap exists because consciousness isn't produced by the brain in any conventional sense, but rather that the brain is what consciousness looks like when observed through the conceptual frameworks of neuroscience. Various meditation traditions describe advanced states where the usual contents of consciousness fall away, while awareness itself remains present and alert. Practitioners report experiences of consciousness without objects, awareness aware of itself rather than aware of particular thoughts, sensations, or perceptions. These states are often described as profoundly peaceful and fulfilling, suggesting that consciousness might be most naturally itself when apparently empty of everything else. But consciousness also demonstrates the unique ability to be aware of its own nothingness, to recognize absence as readily as presence. You can be conscious of what's missing, attentive to gaps in spaces, aware of silence, emptiness, or lack. This suggests that consciousness might be uniquely suited to apprehend various forms of nothingness, not just positive content, but negative space, absent elements, and void itself. The relationship between consciousness and nothing might be more fundamental than it initially appears. Perhaps consciousness is what allows the universe to know itself, including its own emptiness, absence, and void. Perhaps awareness is the space in which the relationship between something and nothing can be discovered, explored, and contemplated. In this view, consciousness wouldn't be something that occasionally encounters nothing, but rather the open awareness in which both presence and absence, fullness and emptiness, something and nothing can be recognized, experienced, and understood. This doesn't solve the mystery of consciousness, but perhaps reframes it. Instead of asking how brain matter creates subjective experience, we might ask how awareness and nothingness relate to each other, how the capacity for experience emerges from or relates to the apparent emptiness in which all experiences arise and pass away. Nothing evokes profound and contradictory emotional responses that reveal fundamental aspects of human psychology, cultural conditioning, and individual differences in how people navigate uncertainty, absence, and the unknown. For some people, encounters with emptiness, void, or non-existence create deep anxiety, existential terror, or overwhelming dread. For others, nothing represents peace, liberation, rest, and freedom from the constant pressure of having to be something specific or accomplish particular goals. The fear of nothing often manifests as horror vacui, literally the fear of empty space, which appears not only in art and design, but in daily behavior and psychological patterns. This shows up as discomfort with silence during conversations, compulsive need to fill empty schedules with activities, anxiety when left alone with unstructured time, or panic when facing uncertain situations where outcomes remain unknown. The empty moment becomes intolerable because it might reveal an underlying emptiness in existence itself, a possibility that some find too frightening to contemplate. Existential philosophers like Jean-Paul Sartre wrote extensively about the anguish that can arise from confronting nothingness directly. The recognition that existence might be fundamentally without predetermined meaning, that there might be no inherent purpose or fixed structure to reality, can create what existentialists call anxiety or dread. This isn't fear of something specific and identifiable, but rather fear of the absence of guaranteed meaning, predetermined essence, or ultimate security. This existential anxiety often crystallizes around thoughts of death, the ultimate nothingness that awaits all conscious beings. The knowledge that individual existence is temporary, that our thoughts, memories, relationships, and projects will someday simply cease, can generate profound psychological distress. Terror management theory suggests that much of human culture, behavior, and meaning-making activity is motivated by the need to manage this fundamental anxiety about personal non-existence through symbolic immortality, legacy creation, and identification with enduring institutions or beliefs. But the fear of nothing isn't always about dramatic existential questions or ultimate concerns about mortality. It can be as immediate and practical as the discomfort of boredom, the restlessness that arises when there's no external stimulation or clear goal to pursue, the anxiety of not knowing what to do with unstructured time. Modern technological culture offers countless methods for avoiding encounters with emptiness. Screens to check, notifications to receive, entertainment to consume, social interactions to maintain, information to process. Social media and digital connectivity have created new, sophisticated methods for fleeing from various forms of nothingness. The moment of potential emptiness while walking somewhere becomes an opportunity to scroll through feeds, check messages, or consume content. The quiet space between activities gets immediately filled with digital stimulation. The fear isn't just of being alone with thoughts, it's of discovering what might or might not be present when all external distractions fall away. Yet for many people, nothing represents profound peace rather than threatening emptiness. The meditation practitioner who discovers spacious silence between thoughts often describes it as deeply nourishing, a relief from the constant mental activity of planning, analyzing, remembering, and problem-solving. People who find comfort in empty landscapes, quiet rooms, solitary activities, or periods of doing absolutely nothing may be accessing something fundamentally restorative about various forms of emptiness. This peaceful relationship with nothing often involves a shift in perspective that transforms how absence is experienced and interpreted. Instead of seeing emptiness as lack or deficiency, it becomes spaciousness and possibility. Instead of experiencing silence as the absence of something desirable, it becomes fullness and completeness. Instead of feeling bored by inactivity, there's contentment with simply existing without needing to accomplish or achieve anything particular. Some spiritual and contemplative traditions explicitly cultivate comfort with various forms of meaningful nothingness. Contemplative Christianity describes resting in divine presence without requiring thoughts, images, words, or conceptual content, finding God in the emptiness that remains when all mental activity quiets. Zen Buddhism values periods of just sitting, meditation that isn't aimed at achieving specific states or insights, but simply allows whatever is present, including nothing, to be exactly as it is without interference or improvement. The difference between fear and peace in relationship to nothing often depends on issues of control, choice, and context. When emptiness feels imposed from outside, unwanted, or beyond personal influence, it tends to create anxiety and resistance. When nothingness is chosen, welcomed, or consciously allowed, it more often brings relaxation and relief. The empty schedule becomes restful when it represents voluntary simplicity, but anxiety-provoking when it indicates unemployment, social isolation, or lack of purpose. Cultural factors heavily influence whether nothing feels threatening or peaceful. Societies that emphasize constant productivity, achievement, growth, and activity tend to pathologize emptiness, treating inactivity and mental quiet as problems requiring immediate solution. Cultures that value contemplation, reflection, and simply being may offer more social support for comfortable relationships with various forms of absence and void. Therapeutic approaches often focus on helping people develop different relationships with uncertainty, not knowing, and empty spaces in experience. Instead of reflexively needing to fill every pause with analysis, every gap with activity, every unknown with anxious speculation, therapy might help someone discover that they can be present with whatever arises, including emptiness, without needing to change or escape it immediately. The aging process frequently involves confronting changing relationships with nothingness as physical abilities decline, social roles shift, and future possibilities become more limited. Some people find these transitions terrifying, experiencing losses as evidence of approaching final emptiness. Others discover unexpected freedom in having fewer obligations and more unstructured time, finding peace in the gradual simplification that aging can bring. Modern physics has revealed that nothing is far stranger and more complex than anyone imagined, overturning thousands of years of philosophical speculation about emptiness and void. What seems like empty space turns out to be seething with invisible activity, and what appears to be the absence of everything might actually be the foundation from which everything else emerges. The more precisely scientists probe the nature of nothingness, the more they discover that perfect emptiness might be impossible not just practically, but according to the fundamental laws that govern reality. Quantum field theory describes what we call empty space as actually being filled with quantum fields in their lowest energy states, a condition that's far from inactive or vacant. These fields permeate all of space and time, and even when they contain no particles or excitations above their ground states, they're constantly fluctuating in ways that have measurable effects on physical reality. The quantum vacuum isn't empty. It's a dynamic medium where virtual particles continuously pop into existence and annihilate each other in time frames so brief they can't be directly observed. The Heisenberg uncertainty principle adds another layer to the impossibility of perfect nothingness by establishing fundamental limits on how precisely we can know certain pairs of properties simultaneously. Applied to energy and time, this means that even supposedly empty space must have energy fluctuations over brief time intervals. The more precisely you try to define a region as containing zero energy, the more undefined its energy becomes over short time periods, leading to quantum fluctuations that make absolute nothingness impossible, even in principle. These aren't just theoretical abstractions. The Casimir effect demonstrates that quantum vacuum fluctuations exert measurable forces on physical objects. When two metal plates are placed very close together in a vacuum, they experience an attractive force that comes from the different wavelengths of virtual particles that can exist between the plates versus outside them. This creates a pressure imbalance that pushes the plates together, confirming that empty space has structure and energy that can influence matter. Dark energy presents an even more mysterious aspect of nothingness. Observations of distant supernovae revealed that the expansion of the universe is accelerating, driven by something that appears to be a property of empty space itself. As the universe expands, creating more empty space between galaxies, this dark energy doesn't dilute, but maintains constant density, suggesting that emptiness itself can generate more of itself. About 70% of the universe consists of this dark energy, making it the dominant component of everything that exists, yet we have no adequate explanation for what it actually is. The cosmological constant problem reveals how little we understand about the energy content of empty space. When physicists calculate how much energy quantum vacuum fluctuations should contribute to the cosmological constant, they get a result that disagrees with observations by approximately 120 orders of magnitude. This isn't a small discrepancy. It's the most spectacularly incorrect prediction in the history of science, suggesting either that our understanding of quantum vacuums is fundamentally flawed, or that some unknown mechanism cancels out almost all of this vacuum energy. Black holes create additional puzzles about the nature of nothingness. General relativity predicts that at the center of a black hole lies a singularity where density becomes infinite and space-time curvature becomes extreme. But what does it mean for space-time itself to break down? Is the singularity a genuine hole in reality, a place where the normal categories of existence and non-existence no longer apply? Or is it a sign that our theories become inadequate at describing extreme conditions? Hawking radiation suggests that black holes aren't entirely black but emit thermal radiation due to quantum effects near their event horizons. This process causes black holes to evaporate slowly, eventually returning all their mass energy to the universe until nothing remains except empty space. Yet this empty space is itself filled with the quantum fields and dark energy that make perfect nothingness impossible, creating a cycle where the most extreme expressions of gravitational collapse ultimately dissolve back into the structured emptiness from which they emerged. The Big Bang itself might represent the emergence of everything from a form of nothingness, though cosmologists are extremely careful about making such claims. Some models suggest the universe could have begun as a quantum fluctuation in a pre-existing vacuum state, while others propose that space-time itself emerged from something more fundamental that can't be described in terms of space, time, or matter. The question of what preceded the Big Bang might be meaningless, like asking what's north of the North Pole, because it assumes the existence of time before time existed. Inflation theory proposes that the early universe underwent a period of exponential expansion that created vast amounts of space from almost nothing. If correct, this suggests that space itself can be manufactured, that the emptiness between objects isn't fixed but can grow, multiply, and reproduce itself. The universe might be mostly composed of nothing, but it's a nothing capable of creating more of itself through processes we're only beginning to understand. Multiverse theories push these ideas even further by suggesting our universe might be just one of countless others in an infinite ensemble. The nothing between universes becomes a kind of meta-nothingness, a void so vast it contains all possible realities. In this view, everything that could exist does exist somewhere, making nothing not the absence of everything but the space that contains infinite possibilities. String theory and other approaches to quantum gravity suggest that space-time itself might emerge from more fundamental structures that exist at scales far smaller than anything we can currently observe. If space and time aren't basic features of reality but approximations that emerge at larger scales, then the nothing we experience as empty space might be constructed from mathematical relationships, information patterns, or structures we don't yet have adequate concepts to describe. So what does all this exploration of nothing mean for how we live our daily lives, how we make sense of our experiences, and how we navigate a world where nothing turns out to be something, where emptiness can be full, where absence might be more fundamental than presence? How do we integrate these insights into practical wisdom for existing as conscious beings in a universe that defies our common sense assumptions about what is and isn't there? Perhaps the most practical lesson involves developing greater comfort with not knowing, with uncertainty, with ambiguity, and with questions that resist easy answers. If nothing itself is paradoxical and mysterious, according to our best scientific and philosophical investigations, then our relationship with uncertainty, the unknown, and the unresolved becomes crucial for psychological well-being and intellectual honesty. The person who can sit with unanswered questions, who can be present during moments when nothing particular is happening, who can find peace in the spaces between more dramatic experiences, might be better equipped for the fundamental uncertainties that characterize human existence. This doesn't mean becoming passive, indifferent, or resigned to ignorance. Rather, it involves learning to distinguish between the kinds of nothing that require active response and the kinds that are better left alone, appreciated, or inhabited consciously. The empty feeling that signals depression might need professional attention and care, while the empty mind that appears during meditation might be something to appreciate rather than immediately fill with mental activity. Daily life offers countless opportunities to practice being with various forms of nothing in ways that can be nourishing rather than anxiety-provoking. The pause between sentences in conversation, the moment of silence before responding to a difficult question, the gap between finishing one task and beginning another, these micro-nothings can become sources of refreshment and clarity, rather than uncomfortable spaces that need immediate filling with activity or analysis. Relationships involve constant navigation of different kinds of nothing and absence. The comfortable silence between intimate friends represents a different quality of emptiness than the awkward pause during conflict. The absence felt when someone important is no longer in our lives creates a different kind of void than the pleasant solitude of choosing to spend time alone. Learning to be present with what's missing, not there, or temporarily absent can deepen our capacity for authentic connection with what is present and available. Creative work often requires embracing nothing as a starting point rather than an obstacle. The blank page, the empty canvas, the silence before the first note of a musical composition, these aren't problems to be solved through force or technique, but invitations to discovery that require patience, attention, and trust in processes that can't be entirely controlled. Many artists and writers report that their most authentic work emerges not from forcing something to happen, but from learning to wait attentively in emptiness until something genuine wants to emerge. Professional life increasingly demands comfort with various forms of nothing and uncertainty. Career transitions involve periods of not knowing what comes next, where identity and purpose might be temporarily unclear. Leadership often requires making decisions with incomplete information, taking action despite significant unknowns. Innovation and creativity require willingness to explore ideas that might lead nowhere, to invest time and energy in projects that might not succeed. The ability to remain functional and even creative during uncertain, ambiguous, or apparently unproductive periods becomes a valuable skill in rapidly changing economic and social environments. The natural processes of aging and mortality eventually require everyone to confront fundamental questions about nothing and absence. As physical abilities change, social roles evolve, and the future becomes less predictable, people often discover new relationships with emptiness, loss, and the approach of final nothingness. Some find these transitions terrifying, experiencing each limitation as evidence of approaching dissolution. Others discover unexpected freedom in having fewer obligations and more unstructured time, finding peace in the gradual simplification that can accompany later life stages. Parenting involves helping young people develop their own healthy relationships with nothing and uncertainty. Teaching children to be comfortable with boredom rather than requiring constant entertainment, to appreciate quiet moments rather than filling every silence, to tolerate not getting what they want immediately, to find contentment in simply being rather than constantly doing. These become gifts that serve them throughout their lives as they encounter the inevitable uncertainties, losses, and empty spaces that characterize human existence. Even mundane aspects of daily routine can be transformed through different relationships with nothing and emptiness. Waiting in line becomes an opportunity for present-moment awareness rather than impatient frustration. Cleaning and organizing become practices of creating physical and mental space rather than mere chores. Falling asleep becomes a daily practice of surrendering to not knowing rather than a struggle to maintain conscious control. The spiritual dimensions of nothing don't require formal religious practice or metaphysical beliefs. Anyone can discover the peace that's available in empty moments, the creativity that emerges from not knowing, the freedom that comes from not having to be someone particular all the time. These discoveries are available whether you frame them in scientific, philosophical, artistic, or spiritual terms, whether you understand them as neurological phenomena, cultural constructions, or glimpses of ultimate reality. Ultimately, learning to live skillfully with nothing might involve recognizing that the search for perfect knowledge, complete security, and absolute meaning might itself be part of what creates unnecessary suffering and anxiety. Perhaps the deepest wisdom involves making peace with the fundamental uncertainty and open-endedness that characterize both scientific knowledge and personal experience. Finding ways to act meaningfully and live fully while acknowledging that much about existence remains mysterious, unresolved, and beautifully empty of final answers. And so, dear listener, we arrive at the end of our gentle voyage through the mystery of nothing, though perhaps end isn't quite the right word for an exploration that has revealed nothing to be inexhaustibly complex, paradoxically substantial, and beautifully resistant to final conclusions. We've wandered through empty spaces and found them bustling with quantum activity, examined absent things and discovered their profound presence in shaping everything around them, sought to define nothing, and found it delightfully undefinable. We've seen that nothing appears everywhere once you learn to recognize it, in the gaps between atoms that make matter possible, in the pauses between thoughts that create mental space, in the silence between musical notes that generates rhythm and meaning, in the darkness between stars that allows light to be visible. Nothing is the quantum vacuum that seethes with virtual particles, the mathematical zero that makes all calculation possible, the empty set from which entire universes of mathematical objects can be constructed. Nothing is the spaces in language that separate words and create meaning, the silence that gives weight to speech, the pause that allows reflection before response. It's the blank canvas that invites creation, the empty mind that permits new thoughts to arise, the open heart that can receive whatever life presents without needing to immediately categorize, judge, or improve it. We've discovered that different cultures, philosophical traditions, and historical periods have had vastly different relationships with emptiness, absence, and void. Some have fled from nothing as if it were dangerous or meaningless, filling every moment with activity and stimulation. Others have embraced various forms of nothingness as sources of wisdom, creativity, and spiritual insight, recognizing that some of life's most profound experiences emerge from spaces of not knowing rather than accumulation of information or achievement. Throughout our exploration, we've encountered nothing's fundamental paradox. The more carefully we examine it, the more substantial it becomes, yet it always retains its essential character as absence, gap, void, emptiness. Physics reveals that perfect nothingness is impossible according to the laws of quantum mechanics, but this impossibility doesn't eliminate nothing. It transforms our understanding of what emptiness means and how it functions in the structure of reality. Mathematics shows us that nothing can be the foundation from which everything else is built, that zero isn't just the absence of quantity, but the generative principle that makes all other numbers possible. Psychology reveals that our minds are constantly encountering and creating relationships with various forms of nothing, from the spaces between perceptions to the gaps in memory that we unconsciously fill with imagination and assumption. Perhaps the most important discovery is that nothing is always relational, always contextual, always defined in relationship to something else. The nothing in your empty coffee cup is different from the nothing between your thoughts, which is different from the nothing that exists in deep space, which is different from the nothing that might have preceded the Big Bang. Nothing comes in countless varieties, each with its own characteristics, effects, and significance. We've learned that consciousness itself has a peculiar relationship with nothingness, being simultaneously the space in which all experiences appear and somehow transparent or empty when examined directly. The awareness that makes all perception possible seems to have no fixed characteristics of its own, yet it enables everything else to be known, felt, and experienced. This suggests that nothing and consciousness might be more intimately related than we usually assume. The fear and fascination that nothing evokes in humans reveals something fundamental about how we're constructed psychologically and culturally. Our tendency to flee emptiness or embrace it, to find it terrifying or peaceful, reflects deep patterns in how we relate to uncertainty, control, meaning, and the unknown. Learning to be comfortable with various forms of nothing becomes a skill that can transform how we navigate the inevitable uncertainties and losses that characterize human life. Even in our digital age, nothing has found new expressions and significance. Binary code transforms nothingness into a functional component of information processing. Virtual reality creates convincing experiences of things that aren't physically present. The internet consists mostly of empty addresses that point nowhere, yet this emptiness is essential for the system's flexibility and continued growth. So what does nothing mean, really? Perhaps it means whatever you discover it means through patient, curious, open-hearted investigation of your own experience. Maybe nothing is the invitation to stop trying so hard to fill every moment with significance and allow yourself to rest in the spacious awareness that makes all moments possible. Maybe it's the recognition that beneath all the activity and achievement and constant becoming, there's always been a quiet space of simply being, always available, never truly absent, closer than your own thoughts. And now, here you are, perhaps a little different than when we began this exploration together, having spent time contemplating one of existence's most beautiful paradoxes. You've kept company with nothing and discovered it was quite something after all. You've explored emptiness and found it surprisingly full of possibility, meaning, and rest. If this gentle journey into nothingness brought you any peace, curiosity, useful confusion, or comfortable bewilderment, I'd be grateful if you shared it with someone else who might appreciate a few quiet moments with this ancient mystery that continues to puzzle and delight anyone willing to give it attention. Sleep well, fellow explorer, and remember, even in your deepest rest, Even in your most dreamless sleep, you're never truly separate from the awareness that makes all experience possible. Somewhere in the spacious consciousness that you are, that you've always been, nothing and everything continue their eternal dance in the gentle mystery of this moment, this breath, this quiet settling into whatever comes next. The nothing is always here, patient and welcoming, ready to show you that what appears to be absent might be the most present thing of all. Sweet dreams,